Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're continuing our comparison of World of Tanks and War Thunder. Now, all of the mechanics we've discussed are all well and good, but in order to truly understand a game, you also have to understand the general map design philosophy and how this translates into the moment-to-moment gameplay. World of Tanks has a very cohesive map design philosophy, often consisting of multiple lanes between 2 and 3. Each lane will have its own attributes that make it better suited or worse suited for certain types of vehicles and certain types of stats. In other words, you'll usually have lanes that are dominated by light tanks and long-range guns, and also much closer range lanes that are dominated by heavy tanks with good hold-down protection. That being said, there are several maps that don't really have a good place for one type of vehicle to play. Himmelsdorf is a prime example in that there are very few good places for light tanks or even medium tanks or tank destroyers that have very little armor in which they can have an impact on the battlefield. And of course, artillery in a close range urban map like this is obviously not going to go very well. On the opposite end of that spectrum is obviously a map like Prokhorovka, where there are no real close range lines of sight you can go for other than maybe the hill, although that takes a very long time to get to, especially if you're in a large, heavily armored and slow moving vehicle. If you're grinding the same vehicle or the same types of vehicles a lot because you're going up a specific branch in a tech tree to get to a specific tier 10 vehicle, this map design philosophy can start to get very monotonous, as you'll often find yourself going to the exact same spot basically every time you play on the exact same map, because there simply isn't much of a compelling reason to go anywhere else. Not only is there not much of a reason to do so, but often straying outside of a lane in which your vehicle is well statted to deal with will lead to you simply getting annihilated by enemies you simply had no chance of ever defeating. The spotting system also leads to a lot of World of Tanks maps having effectively large dead zones or no man's lands in which you can't realistically cross it because you'll simply get spotted and team shot from so many different directions you basically stand no chance of crossing that distance, even if you aren't going to be taken out by a single shot. One aspect of World of Tanks map design that you'll definitely start to notice more and more as you go up in battle rating is how many rubble piles or sand piles or piles of rocks are added to specific lanes to allow hull down vehicles to hide their hull and only show you part of their turret or even just their upper front plate. While these hold down positions can be very common at the main point at which the two teams are expected to fight, you can also find them at several locations beyond that main point as essentially fallback points, and this creates a complex scenario in which even defeating the enemy at the main point at which you're fighting them can often lead to you simply going to another enemy in another very similar position right behind them. You'll also commonly find that the game loves to bookend these major conflict points on the map with long lines of sights and of course things like trees or bushes to allow for concealment for tank destroyers, meaning that you can push through an entire enemy team and then find yourself unable to move further without the assistance of a light tank because you're just getting pelted by vehicles that you can't see. The combined effect of all these features means that World of Tanks maps feel very rigid in terms of how you are expected to approach them as a player and what you as an individual in a specific type of vehicle are able to do at any given moment, and can also lead to a pretty steep learning curve because once you realize you're in a position that isn't well suited to your vehicle, it's often very difficult or outright impossible to change that position on the fly, so that map is probably just going to be a mulligan. World of Tanks has also recently added something called random map events, and these are events wherein you'll see a danger area on the map and you will see a countdown timer, and once that countdown timer goes to 0, something spectacular will happen, usually something like a plane bombing run, a plane crashing, a blimp crashing, etc., and this will change how the map plays, which is an interesting addition. Anything in the danger area at the time the timer goes to 0 will be destroyed, friendly or enemy vehicle, and the specific placement of the events does seem to be thought out to open up the map a bit more and allow for a bit more movement if perhaps it has reached a stalemate, so it is a nice addition to the game. Notably, World of Tanks does have several maps that are exclusively available for tier 10 vehicles, and you will only spawn in them with full teams of tier 10s on both sides. Your teams are going to be split into 3 separate groups, and the maps are noticeably larger than normal, so it is a nice change of pace if you have made it up to the top tiers of the game. As we've discussed a bit in previous sections, despite World of Tanks maps being on the whole relatively small, you do have large flat open areas that you can move around in and generally pretty agreeable terrain modifiers, so simply navigating the map is usually relatively easy and the game on the whole doesn't find itself feeling like a bit of a driving simulator, which is always nice to have. The game also does a pretty good job of telegraphing what buildings are destructible, because generally if a building is destructible it doesn't show up on the minimap, so if you look on the minimap and you don't see a solid object there, that's a good indicator that you probably can destroy it. On top of that, obstacles that directly get in the way of shots are pretty few and far between, and it's generally located to specific parts of maps, so you usually don't have to worry about the difference between high explosive or solid shot shells in most instances, although there are obviously notable exceptions. One area where I do feel like World of Tanks does pretty significantly outclass War Thunder is the unifying visual aesthetic of its maps. It's not simply that the maps look good, but rather that they usually have a strong visual theme, and on top of that they also typically have a strong audio theme with fairly good background music that is diegetic to the map you're currently on, and it does give the maps a very nice overall feel, and I really wish War Thunder would kind of get more on that because it does make the maps feel unique and interesting, even if they do often play very similarly. War Thunder often uses real-world locations for its maps, and by real-world locations, I don't simply mean it is inspired by, I mean often they actually use aerial photography of a given location, at least as the starting point for a map. While this does make the map feel more like real locations than they do in World of Tanks, where they often feel somewhat gamey, it turns out most real-world locations weren't actually designed to be used as a map in a video game, and you do start noticing a lot of cracks. More often than not, there aren't prescribed places in which you are supposed to fight the enemy, you just kind of fight them wherever they show up. War Thunder maps also tend to have a lot of very confined spaces, claustrophobic city streets, weird sniping angles, and of course spawn camping locations, because why not? Depending on the map, it can also be cluttered with things that specifically block certain types of shells, like heat or high explosive shells, making those shells very awkward to use, especially in urban environments where things like light posts, fences, etc. can easily block one of your shells, which is all compounded by the notable inconsistency of the hitboxes in War Thunder that are at best a bit of a mixed bag. As we already discussed, War Thunder is perfectly happy to make an entire map relatively soft ground and thus hard to navigate, either having the entire map be things like snow or sand, and there isn't really a lot of thought given to making sure that you have more than enough room to drive a vehicle around at full speed, so oftentimes, even though vehicles in War Thunder can be faster than their contemporaries in World of Tanks, they often don't get to use this speed really all that much. If I were to describe World of Tanks maps as very regimented, I would describe War Thunder maps as very chaotic. There's a lot of nooks and crannies you can hide in, there's a lot of routes you can take, some of which can get you behind the enemy team, and when you add things like air into the equation, this makes for a lot of maps that end up being at best a giant mess. But I would also say this giant mess is part of the reason why War Thunder can add such a wide array of vehicles. I kind of discussed at the beginning of this comparison that vehicles in World of Tanks had to interact with each other in a specific way, and a lot of that is related to the map design, whereas in War Thunder, because vehicles can often end up in the side of or behind enemies very easily just by wandering down the wrong alley, you can kind of add anything to War Thunder and make it work as long as it is physically capable of destroying the enemies it fights. Now, after the major review bombing campaign that happened a while ago, and we'll discuss a little bit later, the developers have gone back and revamped a bunch of older maps and made them significantly better to play on. That's not to say that they're still great by any means, and there is still a very strong chaotic feel, but maps like Eastern Europe, Poland, etc. have been heavily reworked to make them less of a giant shooting gallery, and even some of the urban maps have gotten significant reworks. On the whole, I would say the maps do play better now, although they could still use some improvement. And of course, a lot of the newer map designs, especially maps like Holland, play significantly better than a lot of the older maps that you'll run into. That being said, as of time of recording, the map Karelia hasn't been updated in a long time, and the collision on a lot of the rocks in the map is very inconsistent. Sometimes a rock sticking out of the ground will do literally nothing and you'll phase through it, and other times your tank will go flying into the air. You just kind of have to know which rocks are real and which rocks aren't on Karelia, and the same problem applies to destructible terrain like buildings. For example, some buildings can be taken out with tank shells, but other buildings, the only way you could realistically take them out would be to carpet bomb the area in a B-17, which, to be fair, does actually happen from time to time. Incidentally, I find it amusing that the random map events recently added to World of Tanks are things like a plane face planting into the ground and taking multiple friendlies and enemies along with a city block with them, and that's just a normal day in War Thunder. One interesting aspect of War Thunder maps is that they don't always take place at the same time of day and even in the same type of weather. This can lead to fairly poor visibility situations or even incredibly fun situations where your team is blinded by the sun and the enemy team isn't, so while it can add some visual variety, it can also be a non-insignificant point of frustration. One aspect of War Thunder that it's hard to truly appreciate until you start playing the game is how unbelievably big some of the maps are. While World of Tanks usually goes with 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer or smaller, with a handful of the smaller ones being a little bigger, War Thunder maps can reach as high as 4 kilometers by 4 kilometers, and that's only the ground battlefield aspect. Remember, there are planes and helicopters, so the actual map, including the area the aircraft can occupy, is around 20 to 30 kilometers squared in most cases. Obviously, the areas that ground vehicles predominantly use are the most heavily detailed and textured, but they are still very large maps. The longest range kill shot that I have landed on a vehicle in the game is 3.27 kilometers, or at least from a ground vehicle to another ground vehicle. The longest range kill shot I've landed with a tank gun on an aircraft was 4.2 kilometers, and the longest range kill I've gotten on a ground battle in general was about 11 kilometers, which does highlight that while the size of the maps is very impressive, you will be a lot less than impressed when you are in a main battle tank and a plane with a laser guided bomb successfully hits you from 8 kilometers in the air. While War Thunder isn't quite at the level of World of Tanks in terms of unifying map aesthetic, and of course doesn't have any diegetic audio, they have at least been trying with maps that have a more different feel, with maps like Sun City and Holland entering the fray, maps that have more vibrant colors or at least a lot more variety in terms of the types of terrain that you can run into, so they are at least putting forth some effort in. Now, just as a side note, there are a lot of gameplay mechanics for both games that I didn't really go into either because they only exist at specific battle ratings or on specific vehicles. In this instance, while it is interesting to note the differences, it's not really going to affect your overall impression of the game. To learn about things like hull aiming mode, siege mode, laser rangefinders, laser warning receivers, hard kill systems, soft kill systems, etc, 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 it is academically interesting to note, but it won't really change your impression of the game. That being said, I am going to briefly touch on War Thunder's arcade mode because that is where the game will spawn you by default, even though most players do eventually migrate to the realistic mode. The two most obvious things you'll notice about the arcade mode is that you get an aiming indicator telling you where your shell will land, along with a penetration indicator that is very similar to World of Tanks. On top of that, you have a spotting system where you can spot enemy vehicles, much like in World of Tanks, and it will outline them. However, unlike World of Tanks, the enemy vehicle does not go invisible simply because an enemy is unspotted. On top of that, the aiming reticle will go away if the enemy is far enough, and the aiming reticle will not show a penetration indicator if the enemy is far enough away. On top of that, the automotive performance of vehicles is somewhat exaggerated, and the penalties for damaged components is somewhat reduced. A fairly large difference between arcade mode and realistic mode is that in arcade mode, you can't take planes or helicopters with you. They are effectively kill streaks like Call of Duty, where you need a certain number of kills in order to be able to spawn one. They will come equipped with weapons that are appropriate for their vehicle type and battle rating. For example, attackers and bombers will have large amounts of ordnance, whereas fighters will only have their basic guns. Your vehicle isn't destroyed when you spawn in one of these, and your vehicle can be found on the ground and destroyed by the enemy while you are up in the air flying your aircraft. Aircraft themselves also receive rocket impact and bomb drop indicators telling you where your weapons will land, which you only get in realistic battles if your aircraft has a ballistic computer. Light vehicles tend to struggle more in ground arcade because obviously it's easier to see them and know they're there, and they don't have a lot of armor. On top of that, you're practically guaranteed to see planes because of how they work, because your opponents don't have to research aircraft, and obviously with the bomb drop and rocket aiming indicators, their ordnance is easier to use. So now that we've covered all the elements to go into an individual match, it's time to start looking at how you research and get the vehicles that you take into that match. In World of Tanks, you start a tech tree by getting the tier 1 vehicle, although when I did start up, I got tier 3 vehicles for USA, Germany, and Soviet Union, so I think that's a new policy to help people get into the higher tiers faster, especially if they already had an account. As you go through battles, you will earn experience with that vehicle, and you can use experience to unlock upgrades, and as you unlock upgrades, one of the upgrades that you unlock is of course the next vehicle in the line. Once you've unlocked all the upgrades for a given vehicle, it will get elite status and it will have increased crew training so you can train your crews on that vehicle faster. Notably, the upgrade modules can cover everything from new tracks, a new radio, all the way up to different turrets and different guns for your tank. In fact, it is fairly common for tanks to have significantly better guns that they can research, even if some of the other elements don't actually change. Now, simply researching an upgrade isn't enough, you actually have to spend the silver to buy it, and when you go to equip it, the game does offer the option to sell the previous piece of equipment, so you do get at least some of the silver back from that transaction. Of course, there are two big things the game doesn't really tell you. The first one is that sometimes researching an element on a specific vehicle will also unlock that exact same element for another vehicle later in the tech tree or even in different parts of the tech tree. This isn't super common, but it does sometimes happen and does give you a nice little bump when it occurs. The second thing the game doesn't tell you is that your vehicle actually has a weight limit, and this is actually somewhat annoying because it turns out your weight limit is altered by taking the tracks upgrade, but you don't necessarily need to research the tracks upgrade to get other things that can increase your weight. So it's a sort of soft prerequisite that you will only find out about after you've already researched something that is too heavy to equip to your current vehicle. This is slightly compounded by the fact that the equipment that you put on the vehicle will also take up weight, and this can make for a somewhat confusing and unintuitive interface, and I'm not really sure why the game still has this system, as it's inconsistent because some vehicles don't require new tracks at all and others absolutely do. And it's also a very new player unfriendly system because it's not exactly intuitive. In order to get to the next vehicle in the line in World of Tanks, you will have to put experience towards specific upgrades that are noted as prerequisites, and then once you do that, you can start putting experience towards that new vehicle. Once you've applied enough experience to that vehicle, you have now unlocked it, except you still need to pay silver to get the vehicle, and you need a garage slot for the vehicle, which won't be that big of a deal initially, but the garage slots will start to run dry after a little while if you don't put any currency into unlocking more. The progression through a given tech tree in World of Tanks is pretty linear. You can simply select a line and then go all the way up that line to the tier 10 vehicle without really having to consider what other vehicles you might have to research. I should definitely mention that World of Tanks has both free experience points and a blueprint system, and in theory you could use them to get another vehicle or skip a vehicle in a line that you didn't really want to play or didn't enjoy. However, in practice, these are very limited resources to the point where it's unlikely you're going to be able to skip an entire vehicle unless that vehicle is pretty low tier, or unless you have been playing the game long enough to have just accumulated a lot of that resource. Now I'm going to take a brief moment to rant because I started a brand new account for the purposes of this series, both kind of because I lost my old account and also because I wanted to see what the new player experience was like as of right now. On my old account, I had the Batchat 25T, the AMX 13105, and the AMX 30B, and the old school Watt players will know that all three of those vehicles branched off of the Batchat 12T back in the day. This made the Batchat 12T the vehicle in the game that required the most experience points to obtain elite status with out of all vehicles in the entire game. On top of that, the Batchat 12T was a tier 8 French light tank, and there was a premium that was relatively inexpensively available in the French tech tree called the ELC Even 90 that was almost objectively better than the Batchat 12T in basically every way. So because the matchmaker puts tier 8 lights versus tier 8 lights, I had to play against the ELC Even 90 a lot in the Batchat 12T, and I got a lot of chances to see exactly how outclassed I was in terms of both spotting and camouflage. Apparently I had blocked a lot of that out of my mind because I didn't really think about it when I had set the goal of grinding to the Batchat 25T for the purposes of this video, except as soon as I got to the Batchat 12T and looked at the research tree, I immediately had flashbacks and started seriously wondering if I had to get a tier 10 to make this video. Obviously I ended up doing it anyway, but I have played more games in the Batchat 12T than any other vehicle in World of Tanks by a very wide margin, and not because I wanted to. In War Thunder, each nation has a set of vehicles called reserve vehicles. Reserve vehicles are free and have no repair costs, and are going to be your jumping off point for that tech tree. In order to research upgrades for a vehicle, all you have to do is select that upgrade in the vehicle modification screen and then start playing games, and any research points you get will be automatically added to it. Notably, the upgrades have 4 different ranks, and you need to complete a minimum number of upgrades from a certain rank to proceed to the next rank. This is indicated on the left hand side of the screen. Of course, once you do complete all of the upgrades for a given rank, it will actually give you a research point bonus to whatever you are currently researching. While War Thunder doesn't generally require you to unlock a gun for your vehicle, it does require you to unlock shells, although whether or not the shells you unlock is better than the shell you start with actually kind of depends a lot from vehicle to vehicle. In order to research a vehicle, it's a very similar story. Just select whatever you want to research and all of the RP you get will automatically be applied to that vehicle. Of note, and this is a very big difference between the two games, RP is applied simultaneously both to a vehicle's modifications and to the next vehicle that you're currently researching. So if I were to earn 2000 RP with a vehicle, I would have 2000 RP both for its modifications and for whatever I am currently researching. Much like World of Tanks, once you unlock an upgrade, you will have to pay some silver to equip it, and of course once you get a vehicle, you will have to pay silver to buy that vehicle. We'll go into this more when we go into crews, but in War Thunder you don't have to pay for any kind of garage slot for a vehicle. Instead, you just pay for crew slots for a specific nation, and that dictates how many vehicles for that nation you can have active at any one time, and you can get up to 5 of these slots per nation without having to pay any gold. One sizable difference between War Thunder and World of Tanks is that any vehicle can research any other vehicle in a given tech tree. That's not to say they are necessarily good at it, and this is where the ranks come in. A vehicle can only efficiently research vehicles that are 1 rank above or below it. The further away 2 vehicles are in terms of rank, the less efficiency you will get. So while you could technically research a rank 7 vehicle with a rank 1 vehicle, it would be very inefficient, and vice versa. The ranks also serve another purpose other than just dictating what you can research effectively. You need a certain number of vehicles of a certain rank before you can proceed to the next rank. It will be listed on the left-hand side of the tech tree exactly how many you need at each point in the process. This also means if you're trying to grind to a specific vehicle at top tier, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to plot out the lines you are researching so that you have enough vehicles at enough ranks to proceed on to the next one. In practice, what this means for researching is that if you want to grind your way to the top, you're probably going to have to get a lot of other vehicles along the way as opposed to simply the ones in the same line as that vehicle. A vehicle's rank affects almost no other aspects of the game other than the light tanks that we talked about earlier, so this does make them essentially just content gating and they serve very little other purpose. Comparing the World of Tanks and War Thunder systems side by side, the only major advantage the World of Tanks systems offers is that if you want a specific high tier vehicle, you can simply grind your way up to it. However, the combination of having to use the same experience pool both to unlock upgrades for the current tank and unlock the next tank, and only being able to use one vehicle to research another vehicle, does make the game awkward at best at researching, and it's not helped at all by the unintuitive weight system. While War Thunder's rank system presents its own set of annoyances, the fact that you can research upgrades for your tank while also making progress towards the next tank, and if you don't like a vehicle you can simply skip it with no consequences, does make it a lot more player friendly. Now it is important to look at the upgrade system in World of Tanks above and beyond the simple researching system, because this is something that War Thunder doesn't really have an equivalent system to. Simply unlocking a tank along with its best gun, tracks, etc. isn't really the end of the process in terms of making it the best that it theoretically can be. Each vehicle is going to have 3 equipment slots, and each of these equipment slots you can put pieces of equipment in to improve the performance of the vehicle. Now it's not till tier 4 that you get the full suite of 3 equipment slots. Tier 3 only has 2, and tier 2 only has 1, and tier 1 vehicles have no equipment slots whatsoever. Equipment slots can do everything from increase your vehicle's view range, to increasing your crew skills, to increasing your reload rate, increasing your accuracy, etc, etc, etc. Starting at tier 6, one of your slots is also specifically allocated to a certain type of equipment and will increase the efficiency of that type of equipment if equipped in that slot. While equipment on very low tier vehicles will run you about 40 to 50,000 silver, equipment on tier 10 vehicles will run you anywhere from 200,000 to 600,000 silver a piece. This means that a single equipment loadout for a single tier 10 vehicle can cost you upwards of 1.5 million silver. Another upgrade system is the field modification system. Once your vehicle has been fully elited, you can now start researching field mods. Starting at tier 6, where field mods are initially unlocked, you will get 5 field modifications, all the way up to tier 10 where you will unlock a full 8 modifications. Some of the modifications allow you to take a penalty on one stat to increase another stat, and some of these penalties are harsh enough that you're better off just leaving that field mod uninstalled, but oftentimes there is a pretty obvious right choice. A tier 10 vehicle has 5 of these such mods, and they cost 150,000 silver apiece for a total of 750,000 silver if you want to install all of them. Another field mod allows you to apply an attribute that you don't already have to one of your equipment slots to allow that equipment slot to be more effective, while another field mod lets you equip a second set of equipments to that vehicle that you can flip between at the beginning of the match. There's also a field mod that lets you switch between a second set of ammunition and consumables at the beginning of the match as well. So in theory, you could have your budget consumables and ammunition loadout and your tryhard consumable and ammunitions loadout and switch them out depending on mode, map, or whether it's a full down tier or a full up tier. You also have directives that you can purchase for bonds that are essentially a one map bonus, either to a piece of equipment or to give your crew access to a crew skill they don't currently have. While in theory these upgrade systems could let you modify a vehicle to suit your personal preferences, in practice most vehicles only have one mostly correct upgrade path they can really pursue, with only the super versatile vehicles having a lot of good options. And of course, since the biggest stat you can't improve is armor, heavy tanks do heavily benefit from something like this because they can just improve areas where they're weak like view range and not really care that much. And that concludes this episode in the series. Make sure to subscribe if you want to catch the last installment where we look at crews, crew skills, monetization, and the economy. Hope you have a great day everybody. Don't commit to shoes.